Jake loved summers at his grandmother's house in rural Vermont. The air was crisp, the woods stretched endlessly, and best of all, there was no school. This summer was special. His best friend Ethan was spending 2 weeks with him. The two boys quickly decided their mission: build the ultimate treehouse. Mrs. Wilson, Jake's grandmother, smiled as she watched them haul scrap wood and tools into the forest. "Be careful in those woods, boys," she warned. "They've got stories of their own." The boys shrugged it off. Ghost stories were fun, but nothing more. Over days, the boys worked tirelessly. By the end of the week, the treehouse stood tall, its wooden planks uneven but sturdy. The tree, an ancient oak, seemed perfect. But strange things began happening as the structure neared completion. It started small. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake thought he heard someone whisper his name. He paused, looking around. Ethan, hammering a nail, didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked. "Hear what?" Ethan replied, not looking up. Jake shook it off. Probably the wind, he thought. But the whispers persisted. Every evening, as they packed up for the day, Jake heard them. Sometimes faint, other times clearer, as if someone stood just behind him, calling his name softly. One night, the boys decided to sleep in the treehouse. They brought flashlights, sleeping bags, and snacks. Around midnight, they were startled awake by a loud scratching noise from beneath the floorboards. "Raccoon?" Ethan suggested, though his voice wavered. Jake hesitated, then pried up one of the loose planks. Beneath it lay an old, dust-covered wooden box. The boys exchanged uneasy glances before opening it. Inside were faded black and white photos of children. Their faces were solemn, their eyes distant. One photo made Jake's blood run cold. It was a boy who looked eerily like him. The same sharp nose, the same dimpled chin. That's you," Ethan whispered. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "Matthew, 1952. The next morning, they showed the box to Mrs. Wilson. Her face turned pale as she examined the photos. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In the treehouse," Jake said. Mrs. Wilson sat down heavily. "I was just a little girl when it happened," she began. "Matthew was the boy who lived here before your grandfather bought the land. One summer, he built a treehouse in the same oak. He used to say he heard voices calling him, but no one believed him." Jake and Ethan leaned in, listening intently. Then one night, the treehouse burned down. They never found Matthew. Some say he ran away, others, well, they say the forest took him. The room fell silent, the weight of the story settling over them. Despite their fear, the boys returned to the treehouse the next day, determined to dismantle it. But as they approached, they stopped in their tracks. The treehouse was fully rebuilt. The old, uneven planks were gone, replaced with polished wood. And hanging from the walls were the photos they had found in the box, now framed and pristine. Ethan's voice trembled. "We didn't do this." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The whispers returned, louder now, blending into a low, haunting hum. "We have to leave," Jake said, pulling Ethan away. That night, Jake woke to a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was a boy, no older than 12, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "Come play with me," the boy whispered. Jake screamed, and the figure vanished. Mrs. Wilson called in a local historian, who confirmed what she feared. "The woods have a long history of strange disappearances," he said. "Matthew's just one of many. That evening, the boys watched from the house as the treehouse inexplicably glowed with an eerie light. Figures moved inside, children, laughing, playing. "I think the treehouse wants company," Jake said, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Wilson made the decision to have the tree cut down. The next day, a crew arrived. As the first chainsaw bit into the oak, the whispers turned to screams, loud and piercing, echoing through the forest. When the tree finally fell, the treehouse crumbled into dust, taking the voices with it. But Jake knew it wasn't over. As they left for the summer, he glanced back at the woods and thought he saw Matthew, standing among the trees, watching. Amanda Harper was thrilled when she found the little house in rural Oregon. It was the perfect place for a fresh start for her and her 10-year-old son, Tyler. The backyard was vast, bordered by thick woods, and right in the middle of it stood an old, weathered treehouse. Tyler's eyes lit up the moment he saw it. "Can I play in it, Mom?" he asked eagerly. Amanda hesitated. The treehouse looked like it had seen better days, but she couldn't resist his excitement. "Sure, but be careful, okay?" Tyler nodded and ran off to explore. For the first few days, Tyler spent every free moment in the treehouse. He called it his secret fort and even started bringing his sketchbook up there. Amanda was glad he was happy until the night it happened. It was past Tyler's bedtime when Amanda heard it. A long, blood-curdling scream echoed from the backyard. She bolted to the window, her heart pounding. The treehouse loomed in the moonlight, but it was silent now. Rushing outside, Amanda found Tyler at the base of the tree, shaking. "What happened?" "Are you hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Tyler's face was pale. "The treehouse, it screamed," he whispered. Amanda frowned, glancing up at the dark structure. It was probably just an animal. "Maybe a fox," she suggested, though she wasn't convinced. Tyler shook his head. "No, Mom. It was the treehouse." The next day, Amanda decided to ask her elderly neighbor, Mr. Clark, about the treehouse. He had lived in the area his whole life and might know something about its history. When she mentioned the scream, Mr. Clark's face darkened. "You should have torn that thing down the moment you moved in," he said. "What do you mean?" Amanda asked, uneasy. "That treehouse belonged to the Johnson family," Mr. Clark explained. "Their two kids, Lily and Ben, used to play in it all the time. One summer night, the whole thing went up in flames. No one knows how it started, but the kids, they never made it out." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. "That's awful," she murmured. Mr. Clark nodded grimly. "Some folks say you can still hear their screams, especially if someone new plays in that treehouse." Determined to get to the bottom of things, Amanda tried to keep Tyler away from the treehouse. But curiosity got the better of him. One afternoon, she found him back inside, sitting quietly with his sketchbook. "Tyler, I told you not to come up here," she said, climbing up after him. "But look, Mom," he said, pointing to the walls. "It's like someone's been writing." Amanda's heart sank as she saw what he meant. Scratches covered the wooden planks, crude symbols and words etched deep into the wood. One message stood out: "Help US." She grabbed Tyler's hand. "We're going inside. Now." That night, Amanda heard the scream again, louder and more desperate. But this time, it didn't stop. The sound grew, filling the house, shaking the walls. Frantic, Amanda called the local historical society. A man named Richard, intrigued by her story, agreed to visit. After examining the treehouse, he confirmed Mr. Clark's tale. But he added something more chilling: the Johnson children's bodies were never recovered. Their spirits, he believed, were trapped, seeking release. "There's one way to end this," Richard said. "You have to destroy the treehouse. Burn it down, and maybe their souls will find peace." Amanda was hesitant but knew she couldn't let this continue. That night, she prepared a can of gasoline. As Amanda approached the treehouse, the air grew colder. Tyler stood by her side, clutching a flashlight. "Do we have to, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, honey. It's the only way." She climbed up one last time, dousing the structure in gasoline. But as she struck the match, the screams began again, piercing, unrelenting. The walls seemed to pulse, and shadows flickered across the planks. "Mom, look!" Tyler shouted. Through the smoke, Amanda saw two small figures, their faces solemn. A boy and a girl, standing silently in the center of the treehouse. With tears in her eyes, Amanda whispered, "It's time to let go." She dropped the match. Flames engulfed the treehouse, and the screams rose to a deafening pitch before abruptly stopping. As the fire died down, the figures vanished. The air grew still, and for the first time, the backyard was silent. The next morning, all that remained of the treehouse was a pile of ash. Tyler held Amanda's hand tightly as they stood over it. "They're gone now, right?" he asked. Amanda nodded, though a part of her wasn't sure. As they turned to leave, she glanced back one last time. In the distance, where the treehouse had stood, she thought she saw two figures waving. Max hated moving. Leaving behind his friends and his school in Detroit to start over in rural Michigan felt like a punishment. But his father's job loss meant they had no choice. The new house was old and creaky, surrounded by dense woods. The only thing Max found remotely interesting was the treehouse in the backyard. It was rickety but intact, nestled high in a towering maple tree. His 8-year-old sister, Sarah, was immediately enchanted. "It's perfect. Let's make it our hideout," she squealed. Max, reluctant but bored, agreed. The siblings spent hours cleaning and decorating it, hauling up blankets and a few old toys. It quickly became their escape from the dullness of rural life. One night, Sarah woke Max, her small hand shaking his shoulder. "Max, did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Max mumbled, half asleep. "Laughing. From the treehouse." Max frowned but dismissed it. "You're dreaming. Go back to bed." But Sarah wouldn't let it go. The next day, she refused to play in the treehouse. Max, curious and slightly annoyed, climbed up alone. The place was quiet, just the wind rustling through the trees. He called Sarah up, trying to prove there was nothing to fear. Reluctantly, she joined him. As they sat in silence, Sarah suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered again. Max strained his ears. Then he heard it, faint, childlike laughter, coming from somewhere in the treehouse. It wasn't coming from either of them. Terrified, the siblings scrambled down and ran inside, telling their father. Mr. Thompson, exhausted from a long day, brushed it off as their imagination. "Old houses and trees make strange noises," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But Max couldn't shake the sound. Determined to prove it was real, he brought a flashlight to the treehouse that night. Alone, he sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed, and just when he began to doubt himself, it came again, a soft, eerie giggle, followed by whispers. Max's heart pounded. He shone the flashlight around and noticed something he hadn't seen before, scratches on the wooden walls. They weren't random, they formed words. Let's play forever." Max bolted down the ladder and didn't look back. The next morning, Max and Sarah confronted their dad again. This time, their insistence prompted him to investigate. He reached out to a local historian, Mrs. Carlson, who agreed to visit. When Mrs. Carlson saw the treehouse, her face turned pale. She revealed the house's dark past. In the late 1800s, the property was home to an orphanage. The children often played in a treehouse built on the same tree. But one day, several of them disappeared, Mrs. Carlson explained. The only clue left behind was laughter heard by the staff late at night. They searched for weeks but found nothing. Over time, the orphanage closed, and the property was sold. Max and Sarah exchanged horrified glances. "They say the children's spirits never left," Mrs. Carlson added. "They linger, looking for new playmates." That evening, Max locked his bedroom window, determined to avoid the treehouse. But around midnight, Sarah shook him awake again. "Max, they're calling me," she said, her voice trembling. Max groaned. "Go back to sleep." But then he heard it. The laughter, louder this time, echoing from the backyard. It was accompanied by faint whispers, indistinct but insistent. They peeked out the window. In the moonlight, the treehouse seemed to glow faintly, and shadows flickered inside, small figures moving as if they were playing. Max's stomach turned. He grabbed a flashlight and, despite every instinct telling him not to, made his way outside with Sarah close behind. As they approached, the laughter grew louder, almost deafening. The ladder creaked as they climbed, and when they reached the top, the inside of the treehouse was empty. Yet the laughter surrounded them, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then, the floorboards shook. The words on the walls glowed faintly, "Let's play forever." Max shouted for Sarah to climb down, but she stood frozen, staring at a shadowy figure that had appeared in the corner, a small boy, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow. "Sarah!" Max screamed, pulling her down the ladder. The siblings ran inside, slamming the door behind them. Their father, now convinced something was wrong, called a local spiritual advisor. The man, Father Jensen, arrived the next morning. "This treehouse was a beacon for lost souls," he said after examining it. "They are trapped, caught between this world and the next, reliving their final moments." Father Jensen performed a cleansing ritual, blessing the treehouse and the land. As he chanted, the laughter faded, replaced by a deep silence. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. When the ritual ended, the words on the walls had vanished, and the treehouse looked old and ordinary again. Life slowly returned to normal. Sarah and Max avoided the treehouse from then on, though it stood as a constant reminder of their chilling experience. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sarah glanced out the window and smiled faintly. "They're gone now," she said. Max nodded, but deep down, he knew he'd never forget the laughter in the dark. The Thompsons were a close-knit family looking for a peaceful escape from the city. When they stumbled upon a secluded house in upstate New York, they knew it was perfect. The property was vast, bordered by a thick forest, with a sturdy old treehouse in the backyard. For the kids, 12-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Lucas, it was an adventure waiting to happen. The treehouse quickly became their haven. Emily loved reading there, while Lucas filled it with his action figures and gadgets. Everything seemed idyllic until the footsteps began. One night, as the family sat in the living room, Emily glanced out the window and frowned. "Dad, did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" Mr. Thompson replied, looking up from his book. "Footsteps," Emily said, pointing toward the treehouse. like someone's walking around up there. Lucas perked up. Maybe it's raccoons. But Mr. Thompson wasn't convinced. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The treehouse was empty, the ladder swaying slightly in the cool night breeze. Nothing there, he called back, shrugging. Probably just the wind. Emily didn't feel reassured. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder and more deliberate, pacing back and forth across the wooden planks. Emily and Lucas listened from their bedroom, too frightened to move. By the third night, it wasn't just footsteps. The siblings heard faint whispers, indistinct and chilling, like someone muttering just beyond understanding. Lucas, Emily whispered, clutching her blanket, "We have to tell Mom and Dad." But Lucas shook his head. "They'll just say it's animals again." The next morning, Emily decided to investigate. She climbed up to the treehouse while Lucas watched nervously from below. Inside, everything looked as they'd left it, except for one chilling detail: muddy footprints. Small, child-sized footprints crisscrossed the floor. "Lucas, look at this," Emily called down, her voice shaking. Lucas climbed up to see for himself. "No way," he whispered. "It hasn't rained in days. How's there mud?" The siblings decided to keep this discovery to themselves, fearing their parents wouldn't believe them. Later that week, Mrs. Thompson struck up a conversation with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. When she mentioned the treehouse, Mrs. Whitaker's face grew somber. "I'm surprised anyone would want to live in that house," she said. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson asked, puzzled. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then sighed. "Decades ago, a little boy named Charlie lived there. He used to play in that treehouse every day. But one summer, he disappeared. His parents searched the entire forest, but he was never found." Mrs. Thompson felt a chill. "That's terrible," she murmured. Mrs. Whitaker nodded. "They say on quiet nights, you can still hear his footsteps. Like he's searching for a way back home." That night, Emily and Lucas sat in their room, unable to sleep. The footsteps had returned, but this time, they seemed heavier, more urgent. "We have to do something," Lucas whispered. "Like what?" Emily replied, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Lucas said. Maybe he's trying to tell us something." Gathering their courage, they grabbed flashlights and headed outside. As they approached the treehouse, the footsteps stopped. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft voice replied, "Help me." The siblings froze. The voice was faint, fragile, like that of a young child. "Charlie?" Lucas asked, his hands shaking. "Help me find home," the voice repeated. Following the voice's plea, the siblings searched the area beneath the treehouse. After digging through layers of dirt and leaves, they uncovered a small, rusted metal box. Inside was a collection of old, faded photos, a few toys, and a crumpled letter. The letter, written in shaky handwriting, was addressed to Charlie's parents. It spoke of his love for the treehouse and how he'd often sneak out at night to play, even when they told him not to. The last line read, "If you find this, I'm sorry I didn't come back." Emily and Lucas felt tears sting their eyes. The siblings brought the box to their parents, who were shocked but finally believed their story. Together, they held a small ceremony, placing the box under the tree and marking it with a small plaque for Charlie, who never found his way home. That night, as the family sat together, the house felt different, lighter, more peaceful. When Emily glanced out the window, she saw a faint figure near the treehouse, a small boy waving, his face serene. "Thank you," his voice whispered, carried on the wind. And then, he was gone. The footsteps never returned, and the treehouse became just another part of the backyard. For Emily and Lucas, though, it would always be more than that, a reminder of the boy who finally found his way home.